On the morning of March 17, 1943, deep inside a dimly lit, wood-paneled office in Berlin, an admiral sat motionless, staring at a single sheet of paper. The world outside rumbled with the echoes of a war still raging, but inside that room, a different kind of explosion was taking place, one made not of bombs, but of numbers. The document on his desk was barely a page long, yet its contents carried more destructive power than any weapon Germany had ever produced. It wasn't about a new secret weapon, or a hidden invasion, or even a new enemy strategy. It was simply a report about a factory, one located thousands of miles away, across the Atlantic Ocean, in the United States. The report claimed that within months, the Americans would be able to produce a 4-engine heavy bomber every 60 minutes. To the men of the Reich, this sounded like fantasy, impossible, even laughable. 1 bomber an hour. Absurd. But the German intelligence officers who had gathered this information weren't dreamers. They were professionals. The data was verified, cross-checked, confirmed. The math didn't lie. What lay before Admiral Wilhelm Canaris that morning wasn't rumor, it was a revelation, a dark prophecy written in cold industrial truth. This was the day when Germany's intelligence service understood what their leaders refused to believe: the war, though still raging, was already lost. Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr, was not like the others around Hitler. He wasn't loud, fanatical, or driven by ideology. He was old school, a disciplined naval officer from the era before Hitler's madness consumed the military. He believed in realism, in facts. Where others saw dreams of empire, he saw logistics, tonnage, production lines, and manpower. His agency, the Abwehr, stretched across Europe, reaching into neutral countries, infiltrating embassies, and intercepting whispers from enemy shores. In the early years, their intelligence had paved the way for German victories. But by 1943, the tide of war had shifted. Stalingrad had fallen. Rommel was being pushed back across North Africa. The Allied bombing raids were increasing. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Reich, was bleeding. The myth of the invincible German war machine was beginning to collapse. And inside Hitler's headquarters, denial had taken root. The Führer's circle was sealed off from reality, surrounded by men too afraid to tell him the truth. Bad news didn't rise to the top. Reports that contradicted his fantasies were buried. But Canaris's agents kept sending fragments of something that couldn't be ignored. A rumor at first, then a pattern. Neutral traders, diplomats, and engineers all spoke of a vast industrial operation in America, a factory so large it supposedly created its own weather. A Swedish engineer wrote that a new American plant was building aircraft on an assembly line. A Spanish businessman reported strange new train schedules shipping raw aluminum into Michigan. A diplomat in Washington overheard Ford executives boasting of a target so insane it sounded like a joke: a bomber every hour. The reports all pointed to the same name, Willow Run. It was an enormous facility under construction by the Ford Motor Company. And its purpose was singular: to build the B-24 Liberator bomber, a 4-engine aircraft that would become one of the most produced planes in history. When Canaris read the projected output, 1 bomber every hour, he froze. Even Germany's best factories couldn't build 1 bomber in less than several weeks. And here was America, threatening to outproduce the entire Luftwaffe from 1 building. To most of the Nazi high command, the idea was absurd. They believed the United States was soft, decadent, a nation of consumers, not warriors. In their view, Americans built toys and refrigerators, not aircraft. But Canaris was not laughing. He had the numbers. If the United States succeeded, that meant 24 bombers a day, over 700 a month, from a single plant. He tried to explain it to Göring's staff. He tried to make them see that the battlefield of the future wasn't in the skies or trenches, it was in the factories. Whoever could produce the most would win, no matter how brave or skilled the soldiers were. But in Nazi Germany, truth was filtered through ideology. The leadership couldn't believe that a so-called mongrel democracy of mixed races and free markets could surpass their master race in efficiency and discipline. To them, it was simply impossible. So the reports were mocked, then shelved. Göring joked that Americans could barely make decent shaving razors, let alone aircraft. Goebbels called it propaganda designed to frighten Germany into surrender. Hitler didn't even read the full report. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the impossible was being built brick by brick. On the outskirts of Ypsilanti, Michigan, an enormous steel skeleton began to rise over the farmland. It would become the Willow Run bomber plant, a marvel of modern engineering, designed by Albert Kahn, stretching more than half a mile in length. It was so big that the end of the factory curved at a 90-degree angle just to avoid crossing into another tax district. Inside, under glaring white lights, the noise was constant, the thunder of machinery, the clatter of rivets, the steady hum of conveyor lines moving like arteries. Tens of thousands of workers, many of whom had never even seen an airplane before, now assembled one every hour. Henry Ford, who had once revolutionized the automobile industry, now promised to do the same for warplanes. He would apply car-making principles to the sky. And his engineers did exactly that. They broke down the B-24 bomber into tens of thousands of parts and created a production line where each worker performed a single specialized task. Rivet by rivet, wire by wire, the massive machine came to life. Not as an individual masterpiece, but as an industrial product, born from rhythm and repetition. The first few months were chaos. The scale was unprecedented. Planes rolled out missing parts, wiring errors caused fires, and early designs had to be re-engineered to fit Ford's methods. But the Americans adapted fast. Within months, the system began to flow with machine-like precision. Trains loaded with raw aluminum and steel entered the plant at dawn. By nightfall, the same material rolled out the other end as fully armed aircraft. It was industrial alchemy, raw or transformed into flying fortresses in a single day. The workforce itself was unlike anything the Germans could imagine. At its peak, over 40,000 people worked at Willow Run, not soldiers or trained engineers, but ordinary citizens, farmers, mechanics, teachers, and secretaries. A third of them were women. They called themselves Rosie the Riveters, and their image would soon become an icon of American resilience. Among them were immigrants, African Americans, and even the elderly. People who, under Nazi ideology, would have been deemed inferior or useless, were now the backbone of the world's greatest industrial miracle. They worked in shifts, around the clock, 7 days a week. The plant never slept. And the bombers kept coming, one every hour, just as the report had said. By the time the German leadership stopped laughing, the sky over Europe was beginning to change. American bombers, thousands of them, were appearing over German cities. They came not in handfuls, but in waves so vast they darkened the daylight. Each one carried not only bombs, but a message that the war of production was over before it had even begun. Back in Berlin, Canaris tried once more to sound the alarm. His message was simple: Germany could not outbuild the Allies. The United States was producing weapons faster than Germany could destroy them. For every bomber the Luftwaffe shot down, 3 more rolled off the line in Michigan. He saw the truth clearly: this war was no longer about bravery or tactics. It was about scale. But truth was poison in Hitler's circle. Göring dismissed Canaris's warnings with contempt. Then we'll simply shoot down more of them, he said. Hitler didn't want statistics, he wanted faith. Canaris knew what that meant. The leadership would choose delusion over data. Pride over reality. And so, that morning in March 1943, as he folded the report and placed it back into its envelope, he knew exactly what he was holding. It wasn't just intelligence. It was an obituary for the Third Reich, written before its death. By the spring of 1943, the skies over Europe began to change. At first, the German people barely noticed it, the distant hum of engines, the faint shimmer of silver shapes high above the clouds. But within months, that sound became impossible to ignore. The Allies had arrived. The B-24s that once existed only in the pages of Canaris's intelligence reports were now flying in formation, hundreds of them, sometimes thousands. They came in waves that seemed endless, each wave more coordinated, more confident than the last. At first, the German fighter squadrons rose to meet them. Pilots who had once felt untouchable now found themselves outnumbered and outpaced. The Luftwaffe was running on fumes. Experienced pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced. Fuel was scarce, replacement parts even scarcer. Meanwhile, the Americans and British were building aircraft faster than they could count them. Factories like Willow Run became living symbols of unstoppable momentum. It wasn't just a plant anymore, it was a heartbeat, a pulse of steel and energy driving across an ocean. Every hour, a bomber lifted off the runway, its engines roaring, its body gleaming under the morning light, destined for a sky half a world away. Inside those bombers sat crews barely out of their 20s, engineers, mechanics, young men who'd grown up in the Depression and now found themselves flying over cities they'd only seen in newspapers. They weren't professional soldiers. They were citizens, farmers, clerks, machinists, ordinary people fighting an extraordinary war powered by machines their families helped build. Each mission carried a piece of America's industrial soul. From the skies, the bombers saw Europe wrapped in smoke. Rail lines were ripped apart, oil refineries burned for days, and the very heart of Germany's war machine, its factories, its infrastructure, began to crumble under the relentless rain of explosives. And still, back in Berlin, Hitler refused to believe the scale of it. He called the bombings a temporary nuisance. He ordered new wonder weapons to be developed, jet fighters, rocket bombs, experimental tanks. He promised that one breakthrough would turn the tide. But the truth was, even the most advanced weapon meant nothing without the capacity to produce it at scale. The Allies understood that better than anyone. Their strategy was simple and merciless: destroy Germany's ability to make war. Not just soldiers, but fuel, transport, supply, the arteries that kept the Reich alive. Every day, Canaris watched the numbers change. Reports came in from the front lines: another refinery lost, another train yard flattened, another aircraft plant erased. Each message confirmed what he had seen coming months ago. He stopped trying to warn anyone. Inside the Abwehr, whispers began to spread. Some of his officers had started quietly helping anti-Nazi resistance groups. Others leaked information to neutral diplomats. They all understood what Canaris knew: the war could no longer be won, it could only be prolonged. And prolonging it meant more death. The bombers didn't stop. By late 1943, they were flying in massive formations that stretched across the horizon. Tight, disciplined, mechanical. Each one dropped tons of explosives with surgical precision, guided by new radar systems and advanced navigation technology that Germany hadn't even imagined possible a few years earlier. From the ground, civilians stared up in horror and disbelief. The sky was filled with thunder, an unending roar. The once mighty Luftwaffe scrambled whatever fighters it could, but it was no longer a fair fight. The German pilots who survived their missions came back shaken. They had never seen such numbers, such coordination, such sheer mechanical dominance. Even Hitler's most loyal generals began to sense the truth. Quietly, behind closed doors, they admitted to each other what none dared say aloud in front of him: that Germany's defeat was no longer a matter of if, but when. But Hitler lived in a different world now. He retreated deeper into his headquarters, isolated, suspicious, listening only to those who told him what he wanted to hear. He blamed his generals for cowardice, his engineers for sabotage, his workers for laziness. Never himself. Never the system he had built. He still spoke of victory, of a final counterstrike that would turn everything around. But his speeches began to sound hollow, even to those who cheered. Meanwhile, across the ocean, the miracle of production continued. Ford's plant in Michigan was joined by others, Consolidated, Douglas, North American. Together, they formed an industrial chain unlike anything the world had ever witnessed. In 1 month, the United States produced more aircraft than Germany could build in half a year. Ships rolled off American docks faster than the Kriegsmarine could sink them. Tanks, guns, trucks, radios, uniforms, everything multiplied. The factories never rested. Day and night, assembly lines moved, fueled by a workforce united by a single purpose. Women worked in coveralls, welding steel under the glow of molten light. Men too old for battle drilled, forged, and assembled weapons for soldiers they'd never meet. Each hammer strike, each rivet, each wheel turn became part of a collective rhythm that echoed across the world, the rhythm of inevitability. In Germany, the contrast couldn't be starker. Allied bombs crippled transport networks. Factories relocated underground. Trains ran on desperation and hope. The once proud industrial empire of the Reich had become a patchwork of ruins, scattered and starving. Even the propaganda began to falter. Posters that once spoke of victory now pleaded for endurance. Radio broadcasts filled with hollow promises. The people were exhausted, living on ration cards and fear. Canaris walked the corridors of Berlin in silence. The man who had once believed he could serve his country by revealing truth now understood that truth no longer had a place here. He had seen the future, and it was measured not in faith or speeches, but in production rates and supply chains. The future belonged to those who could build. By late 1944, Willow Run had produced over 8,000 bombers. Across the ocean, fleets of them now filled the skies over Europe in perfect formation, black silhouettes gliding through the clouds. Their engines echoed like the heartbeat of an empire that no bomb could silence. Below them, cities that once symbolized Nazi strength, Hamburg, Dresden, Essen, were turned into firestorms. The same German industrial centers that had built the Reich's weapons now burned under the weight of another industrial force far greater than theirs. From his bunker, Hitler still shouted orders no one could fulfill. His factories no longer had power. His railways no longer had fuel. His soldiers no longer had hope. And yet, the bombers came. Hour after hour, day after day. The vision that Canaris had read on paper 2 years earlier was now reality, roaring over the ruins of Berlin. By then, even the most loyal believers began to understand that the war had not been lost on the battlefield. It had been lost long before, on the factory floor. Canaris knew it all too well. He watched as the empire he had served fell apart piece by piece, destroyed not only by bombs, but by arrogance, by the refusal to see that the true weapon of war was not ideology, but industry. He had tried to tell them. He had written it plainly. But truth, in the Reich, was more dangerous than defeat. When Hitler finally discovered that the head of his own intelligence service had begun secretly aiding those who sought peace, it was too late. The war was collapsing, and so was the regime. Canaris was arrested, imprisoned, and later executed. His name was erased from official records. His warnings buried. But history remembered the moment he understood what others could not, that a single report about a factory in Michigan had foretold the end of an empire. And when the last B-24 bombers returned home, their wings blackened from smoke, their missions complete, the men who flew them had no idea that their greatest victory had begun not in the air, but in the mind of a German admiral staring at a piece of paper in 1943. By 1945, the war that had once promised a 1,000-year Reich was reduced to ash. Germany was no longer a nation, it was a graveyard of its own ambitions. Entire cities had been erased, replaced by endless plains of rubble and smoke. The rivers ran black with oil. The sky hung heavy with the ghostly haze of burned steel. In the final months, there was no strategy, no grand design, only chaos. The once mighty Wehrmacht was retreating in every direction, the Eastern Front collapsing under the Soviet advance, the Western Front torn open by the Allies. The roads were filled with refugees, mothers carrying children, soldiers without rifles, the remnants of a nation that had finally awakened to the nightmare it had created. And yet, inside his underground bunker in Berlin, Adolf Hitler still believed that victory could be snatched from the jaws of defeat. He spoke of imaginary divisions that no longer existed, of counterattacks that would never come, of secret weapons that could still save him. But outside, his empire was dying. Above the crumbling city, the air trembled once more. The sound that had haunted Germany for 2 years returned, the distant drone of engines, multiplied 1,000-fold. The bombers were back. They came in formation, wings glinting against the cold gray sky. Each one carried thousands of pounds of bombs, but by then, they didn't even need to drop them. The war was already over, they were only sealing its fate. The people who still lived in Berlin didn't run anymore. They just watched. Some out of fear, some out of resignation. The sound had become familiar, almost symbolic, like the ticking of a clock counting down to the end. It was the sound that had first been written in Canaris's report 2 years before, the sound of inevitability. The Luftwaffe barely existed. Its airfields were bombed to craters, its pilots either dead or captured. Even when they managed to scramble a few planes, they were met by swarms of Allied fighters that seemed to pour endlessly from the clouds. The skies belonged entirely to the enemy now. And still, deep inside the Reich, many refused to believe. They called it bad luck, or divine punishment, or betrayal. But the truth was much simpler. Germany had lost the moment it refused to understand the kind of war it was fighting. While the Reich dreamed of racial destiny and willpower, the United States had built something far greater, a machine of production powered by ordinary people. Each worker at Willow Run, each riveter, each mechanic, had done more to win the war than the greatest generals of the age. They didn't fight for ideology. They fought for a future. When the Allies finally crossed the Rhine, when the Soviets reached the outskirts of Berlin, and when Hitler's empire was reduced to a handful of streets, the report that Canaris once held had long been forgotten. No one spoke of the day the spies had realized the war was lost. But its truth lived in every shattered German city, in every cratered railway, in every silent factory where machines had stopped turning. The war had proven something few had understood before, that the modern battlefield was not just fought with bullets and bravery, but with blueprints, factories, and the will to organize. The side that mastered industry mastered war. When Hitler finally took his own life in April 1945, the world he had tried to build collapsed with him. Above the ruins of Berlin, American and Soviet aircraft flew in wide circles, their shadows sweeping across streets where nothing living moved anymore. The Third Reich was gone. Thousands of miles away, in Michigan, Willow Run slowed. Its assembly lines began to fall silent one by one. The workers who had spent years building bombers now turned to other tasks, cars, engines, tools for peace instead of war. The plant that had once produced a bomber every hour became quiet again. The floodlights dimmed. The engines cooled. But the spirit that had lived there, the belief that anything could be built if people stood together, lingered like a hum in the walls. Historians would later argue about what truly ended the war. Was it Stalingrad? Normandy? Hiroshima? But those who looked deeper found their answer in the numbers. The United States built over 300,000 aircraft during the war. Germany built less than a third of that. For every tank the Reich produced, the Allies built 5. For every ship it sank, 10 more took its place. The victory was written in steel and sweat, not in speeches. In the years that followed, the Willow Run plant stood as a silent monument to what industrial will could achieve. The hangars, once echoing with the sound of machines, were turned into storage. Decades later, when historians walked through its empty halls, they could still feel it, the faint vibration of a time when every noise, every spark, every heartbeat was part of something vast and unstoppable. And far from that place, in a forgotten prison cell, the men who had first read the truth, Wilhelm Canaris, met his end. In April 1945, just weeks before the war ended, he was executed by his own government, hanged in the Flossenburg concentration camp. His last words were said to be a quiet prayer. He died knowing the truth he had tried to tell, that the war had been lost not in battle, but in the arrogance that refused to see beyond ideology. When the war ended, the Allies uncovered what remained of the German High Command's archives. Among the endless papers and coded reports, they found one dated March 1943. A simple intelligence briefing, describing an American factory that could produce a bomber every hour. No one in Berlin had listened. But the world that followed was shaped by what that single report foretold. A world where power was no longer measured by territory, but by production, by innovation, by the ability to create. The age of industrial warfare had begun, and it had been born in the assembly lines of America. The war that began with ideology ended with engineering. The men who once built B-24 bombers went home, raised families, built cars, bridges, and highways. The women who riveted wings and wired engines became symbols of a new era, proof that unity could achieve what tyranny never could. And though Willow Run would one day close, its story never really ended. Because the idea it represented, that ordinary people, working together, could create something extraordinary, would echo for generations. If you look at the photographs taken in 1943, rows of workers smiling beneath the glare of factory lights, bombers stretching endlessly down the line, you can almost hear the sound that once filled the air. The hum of machines, the rhythm of hammers, the pulse of a nation building not just planes, but destiny. That was the real miracle of Willow Run. And somewhere, in another world, perhaps even Canaris would have understood that. That the strength of a nation was not found in fear, or control, or race, but in the quiet, determined hands of those who build. The day the German spies realized the war was lost wasn't the day they read the report. It was the day they understood that no empire could defeat an idea, the idea that freedom, multiplied by industry, could create something unstoppable. The sound of bombers in the sky, the roar of engines built by men and women who believed in something greater than themselves, that was the sound of history changing. And it began, as all great changes do, with truth. This was March 17, 1943. The day German spies knew the war was lost. If you found this story powerful, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and join us as we uncover more forgotten moments that shaped human history, here on Neuromind.